Welcome to this presentation of the Carolina Journal poll for March of 2024. My name is Mitch Kokai. I'm with the John Locke Foundation, and I am joined by David Larson, who is the opinion editor at Carolina Journal. Thanks for joining me.
Thanks, Mitch.
And if the name Carolina Journal poll sounds unfamiliar, it is a long-standing poll, but the name recently changed. As of 2024, what used to be the Civitas poll is now the Carolina Journal poll, but it's the same poll that you know and love that has been so accurate and so well respected for years in North Carolina politics and public policy. We work with the group Signal, which actually does the polling, and we're going to start right away with some of the information on the background of the poll. This is a poll of likely general election voters in North Carolina. Signal surveyed 600 people on March 6th and 7th, and we chose those dates for a purpose. It was right after the primary election. We wanted to get out into the field and see what people think about major issues in politics and public policy, including big statewide elections. The margin of error in this poll is 3.99%. So as long as you're at about 4% or more, you could feel fairly confident in the results. Anything within 4% is the margin of error and really could go either way. Well, with all of that background now, David, it's probably a good idea for us to just go ahead and start with the poll results. Good. We're going to go, first of all, with vote method. And basically, that is the question of how people plan to vote when they head to the polls for the general election in November. And as we could see from the poll results, most people are either split between voting on Election Day or voting early in person. About 51% saying on Election Day, either definitely or probably. 44% voting early in person, either definitely or probably. And about 5% of people say they're going to vote absentee by mail. This is probably not terribly surprising. If we have a chance to look at the slide, you see there is a definite partisan split, liberals and conservatives taking a different approach.
Absolutely. Yeah, that was something we saw last election, is there was, with some of the ballot law changes that during the pandemic came about, there was some distrust around voting by mail or voting early, and there's kind of a big Republicans being more traditional on some things, a big focus on come out to vote on Election Day. It's kind of a big part of the election is having that day is somewhat sacred, so you see that translate, but you also do see a fairly even split between the two. So strategically, a lot of people are saying it's probably better for Republicans not to dismiss early voting as a way to bank their vote. So, that's seen in the numbers.
Yeah, and in fact, we know that the Republican Party as a party has been really trying to convince a lot of people to get out there and vote early, because we know from their vantage point, they'd like to see a lot of those votes early so they can focus on the harder to get votes later on, as Democrats have done for years. Let's go ahead and move on to the next question. This is one that we ask typically, and that is the U.S. Moving in the right direction or off on the wrong track? And we find once again this month that people are overwhelmingly saying wrong track. It's 26% who say that things are moving in the right direction, 66% who thinks things are on the wrong track. And right direction has improved a little bit since January, up from 23% to 26%. Wrong track has gone down from 67% to 66%. But still, about 2/3 of people think we're not really heading in the right direction.
Exactly. That's not always a good number for an incumbent. That often hurts the incumbent party, for whoever the president is. Down ballot, that can hurt them a little bit. And you see that in the numbers. The partisan breakdown is the only group that thinks we're on the right track is Democrats. 52% say we're on the right track, while independents kind of follow Republicans in thinking that things are not going on the right track, which might reflect on top of the ticket.
And it'll be very interesting to see where that number is when we get closer to November. Let's move on now. This is an interesting one. What is the top issue? Which of the following among those that were offered was most important to you as you cast votes in the primary election? We found that immigration ended up being the top of the list at 25%. The economy was at about 18%. Abortion, 13%. Inflation just under 10%, about 9.5%, and then you see taxes and spending a little under 7%, public safety about 5%, education 4.5%, energy and the environment 3%, people 5% were unsure, and then 11% of those who we surveyed didn't vote in the primary election, so they chose that option. What did you make of that?
I think this is another area. This kind of goes to show, Republicans might have an advantage in some areas, especially, what they're talking about, what voters are thinking about, is that the issues that Republicans are focusing on seem to be the issues that the electorate's focused on, like immigration. You see Democrats, only 8% of them that's their top issue, but overall it's the top issue. It's the top one for independents. So if Democrats aren't really talking about it, aren't concerned about it, at the State of the Union, you saw there was more concern about using the word illegal than there was the fact that illegal immigrant had killed somebody. Then that was a major news story for a lot of people that they think that's a relevant story. Same thing with the economy. The issue that maybe Democrats had as their top issue was abortion, but only 3% of Republicans and 9% of independents did. So it seems like maybe the one that they think that would be a winning issue for them, but voters aren't seeing it as the top issue for them.
It'll be very interesting to see how that plays out when we get to the general election. Abortion has been an issue that the Democrats have been talking about ever since the Dobbs decision. It's been a major issue for them. Let's move on now to the next question. We asked people, now that the primary is over, how satisfied are you with the choices for the general election? And we found that it was interesting to see that about 60% of people said they were satisfied. About 25% completely satisfied, 35% somewhat satisfied, 30% were dissatisfied. What do you make about that?
Yeah, I thought that was interesting, especially since there's been kind of a narrative, no labels. Obviously, they're making a decision, an announcement today. I don't know if it's the actual ticket they're going to announce, or it might be the process for choosing a ticket. But they've said they're going to choose. This is a kind of a third-party movement, no labels, but. The premise there is that people are not satisfied with the options. However, if there does seem to be some consolidation in around these candidates, or not consolidations, but just people becoming more satisfied with them as at the top, then that might take away a little bit of their rationale. So maybe in the end, people will rally around Trump and Biden, even if earlier on they weren't as excited about them. Sometimes you stick with. There's a rallying around that does happen after the primaries often.
And one of the interesting things about the folks who registered to be no labels, they couldn't vote in any primary because their party was no labels, and you can't vote in another party's primary if you are part of an official party. So very interesting for them. Let's move on now to something that's been a big issue for a number of years and has finally come to pass in North Carolina, and that is voter ID. This is the first major election in which voter ID has been present in North Carolina. We used it for the municipal elections, but now 2024, big election for primaries and the general election. We asked people, did you have a photo ID for the 2024 primary election? 86% said yes, and you might think, well, that's kind of low, but then 12% didn't vote in the primary. So only 2%, 14 of the actual people who were contacted said that they did not have a photo ID. And as we heard quite a bit, there was a lot of discussion about the voter ID requirement not really being a major issue in the primaries. No one raised a big stink about there being major problems. The head of the state Democratic Party at one point tweeted out about some student who had a problem using an ID, and then several tweets later, it was revealed that problem was resolved. So it doesn't seem like voter ID was a big deal.
Absolutely. I'd be interested to talk to those 14 people, that 2.3%. Did they show up and then they had to use, they can use another type of ballot.
Cast a provisional ballot.
Provisional ballot, yes. So, what exactly happened in their particular cases, because maybe I don't think many of them they didn't show up, or because they didn't have an ID, or they're turned away completely. Usually there's a very specific story there. So,
very interesting. Now we're going to move on to some of the actual voting. But this is a question that we ask typically in these polls, and that is, if the 2024 general election for General Assembly were held today, would you vote for a Republican candidate or a Democratic candidate? We don't ask about specific candidates because you'd have to have 170 different options for people since we have districts. That's why we ask on the generic ballot. And in this case, 49% of the people surveyed said they would vote for the Republican candidate, 43% for the Democratic candidate. That's actually a little bit of a gain for the Republicans. The margin is about the same since January, about almost a 6-point margin. Now it's a little bit more than a 6-point margin. Good news for Republicans.
Definitely. I think also good news for Republicans is that the unaffiliateds, which we put independent, same idea, is they're favoring Republican candidates 47 to 37, and increasingly people are registering as unaffiliated. So if that large block a lot of the people in that large block tend to vote with one or the other party, but it just gives you a kind of glimpse into where that large block of unaffiliated voters is leaning.
And then we ask a similar question about Congress, and that is, regardless of legislature, if you had to vote for generic Republican or Democratic in the congressional race, what would you vote for? Once again, Republicans with the advantage, 48% to a little less than 43% for the Democrats. Again, good news for Republicans.
Absolutely, yeah, very similar numbers, but that favors the Republicans. And with the new districts, I think Democrats, there's been a lot of attention on it being a 50-50 state, but even a few points, like if there's a 6-point margin, you spread that out over a lot of areas, like a lot of these many rural counties, if it's 60-40 Republicans, that ends up, that 6% can end up meaning many more seats in a map that has the districts drawn to those provisions that require whole county and all of that. So I think that gives you a hint to why maybe they'll have a couple pickups too with the new maps.
Yeah, it'll be interesting to see. As we know, all of these are done by districts, and some of the districts very much favor Republicans, others very much favor Democrats, and then there will be swing districts that will help decide what the congressional delegation looks like, and on the legislative front, whether Republicans end up having majorities or potentially supermajorities that would make the gubernatorial veto not as important. Moving on now, we also ask, typically in these polls, about job approval for both the president and the governor. And in this case, as we have seen in other polls, there's a stark contrast. We ask first about President Biden's job approval. 38% approve of the job he's doing, 59% disapprove. That's got to be something that is of concern to Democrats.
Yeah, those are disastrous numbers. 59% saying that they disapprove, and among independents, 63% disapproval to 30% approval. That's a huge, drag, having that at the top of the ticket, and especially as our next one will show, Cooper. He's not going to be on the.
We're going to switch over.
Yeah, Cooper remains fairly popular. He has as it shows there, 49% approval and only 43% disapproval, but that's not going to help them this cycle. You're not going to have Cooper at the top. You're going to have Stein, which is a little more of an unknown quantity among voters. So is he going to be able to kind of have that strength at the top of the ballot that Cooper has had? If it's just Biden and then an unknown quantity, then that's not necessarily a good sign for the Democrats, especially with independents leaning so heavily against Biden and saying it's a wrong track and kind of favoring on the generic ballot Republicans.
And Cooper's job approval has gone up since the last time that we polled this, which was November of 23. He only had a 2-point margin. Now it's up to about 6 points. 49% approved to 43% disapproved. David, we're going to go ahead now and move to the big races that people are really concerned about, and that is what's coming up with the November elections. First, we're going to start with the presidential race. Right now, we know that the big candidates for the big parties are, once again, Donald Trump and Joe Biden. We asked people who they'd vote for, and the question was Donald Trump, Joe Biden, or someone else. And we see that Donald Trump had 45%, Joe Biden 40%, 9% someone else. What'd you make of that?
Yeah, I think we're talking about no labels, that there is that chunk of people that they're not very satisfied with these two choices. And so, there's RFK Jr., he's floating out there as an option, and then maybe no labels. They're still pretty quickly after the primary this was taken, so that rallying around that tends to happen throughout, after the primary. That hasn't fully happened yet. So, but you do see, that really negative approval rating for Joe Biden is probably creating a floor for him that's, around 40% here. And I don't know if that last 9% that says someone else, and the 5% undecided, if, Donald Trump doesn't have much further to go to push him over 50%. And if there's a bunch of candidates, he might not need to go over 50%.
Yeah, in fact, last time around, he didn't get 50%, and I don't think he had 50% when he ran against Hillary Clinton, but he had enough. He had enough to have an advantage over both of those candidates. Let's move on now to the governor's race. We've already alluded to Josh Stein will be at the top of the ticket for Democrats this time, not Roy Cooper, and he will be running against Republican Mark Robinson. We see that if you throw in the Green Party candidates and the Libertarian candidates, that Mark Robinson has the plurality at 44% to Stein's 39%. Once again, a gap of 5. Before we get to that, I failed to mention on the presidential election, Donald Bryson, the CEO of the John Locke Foundation, mentioned to me that the Real Clear Politics average of Trump versus Biden was about 5.5%. Our poll shows 5.4%. So we're right in that same territory. But once again, moving back to governor, Robinson with a 5-point edge over Stein at this point. That's pretty interesting, especially for all of those people who've been saying, "Oh, Mark Robinson can't win a general election. He's going to be terrible for Republicans up and down the ballot." At least this poll doesn't suggest that's true.
Yeah, he's a very unique candidate. I guess he's very charismatic, and I think some of what he has said, maybe inartfully, even if it's misconstrued on WRL or NNO, and you see maybe not exact context given, but the statements that he's made, I think, have been a drag on him a bit. But you also see among the black voters on this, he would be the first black governor, and he has an extra 5% compared to what the black vote has been given on for the generic congressional ballot or Donald Trump. So that extra 5% could, that makes up this. It would be a very close race, dead even if it wasn't for that. So that could, it'd be interesting to keep watching that if he continues to overperform in the black vote, and also how some of these negative ads. He might be a little like Donald Trump in the, where things kind of flow off of him. If even there's a ton of negative stories already on him. If that. He already has a very large name ID, so has the damage been done on all of that and then everything's baked in? Or is that stuff going to keep kind of pulling on him and making this a closer race?
We'll be watching that very closely. Already significant that Mark Robinson is the first major party nominee for either party for governor who is black. And when we have this election, assuming that one of the major party candidates win and then a Libertarian or Green doesn't come out of nowhere, we will either have the first black governor in North Carolina or the first Jewish governor in North Carolina, either of which would be quite significant. So we're going to move on now, and we're going to move fairly quickly through the rest of these and then get back to the analysis. But these are all other statewide races that have now become clear because nominees have been chosen. First of all, Attorney General, this is going to be the matchup of Congressman, either Republican Dan Bishop or Democrat Jeff Jackson. We see that Bishop has about a 2-point lead, 41% to 39%. Looking at the race for state Supreme Court, there is one state Supreme Court seat up this time, and we have the incumbent appointed, Allison Riggs, against Republican Jefferson Griffin. Once again, a 2-point lead for Griffin, 41% to 39%. We're going to look at Labor Commissioner, which is an open race because Josh Dobson is not running again. Republican Luke Farley versus Democrat Braxton Winston. And you'll see in all of these Council of State races, Republicans in our poll have an advantage. This is the one with the largest advantage, with Farley at 42% to Braxton Winston's 35%, a 7-point gap. Moving on to the state treasurer's race. Once again, this is open because Dale Folwell, the treasurer, ran for governor, lost in the primary. You see Republican Brad Briner and Democrat Wesley Harris. Once again, a 6-point lead here for Briner at 43% to 37% for Harris. Moving on to insurance commissioner. This is a race between the incumbent Mike Causey, the NNO's favorite candidate. They've been trying for months to do something to knock out Mike Causey, but he won his primary and faces Democrat Natasha Marcus. Once again, about a 6-point edge, 43% to 37%. And the last one, The superintendent of public instruction, this is one in which Republican Michelle Morrow knocked off the incumbent, Catherine Truitt, in the primary. She faces Maurice Mo Green. Not that Mo Green, if you're Godfather fans. This is the guy who was the superintendent of the Guilford County Schools, and before that had a major role in the Charlotte-Mecklenburg schools, was also the head of the Z. Smith Reynolds Foundation at one point. So a stark contrast there. Once again, the Republican Michelle Morrow with an edge, 41% to 39%. Lots of interesting races. Reminding folks that this is a poll that has a margin of error of plus or minus 4%. So the Bishop and Jackson, Griffin and Riggs, and Morrow Green races are all within that margin of error. Slight leads for the Republicans, but definitely within the margin of error. Among all of those Council of State races that we've looked at, what are some of the things that really stood out to you?
I think, yeah, even though there's that margin of error, just the fact that, the Republicans maintain an advantage, maybe a floor of a +2, even within that margin, but that, there's a few candidates that, like Michelle Morrow and a couple others with that +2 having that advantage. Some of them are newer. She jumps out as just one that was able to do a lot with very little. So maybe I think she was outspent 10-1 with Kathy Truitt, and she had a good grassroots campaign that kind of took a lot of people by surprise. So that's one, it'd be an interesting one to keep an eye on, because I don't think she has a lot of experience per se in professional education. She's been an activist on the issues and been a homeschool mom, so that's not nothing. That's
right.
That's a lot of personal experience, but so that'll be an interesting one to watch for me. And then also the Jackson Bishop one is bound to be a really exciting one. Those are
you
both
have a personal connection to that one.
Yes, I did. I used to work for Dan Bishop when he was State House and State Senate. So I know he's a very intelligent man. He's a lawyer, and he's very quickly went from State House to State Senate to U.S. Congress, and then now AG. And a lot of people say AG is almost governor. Who knows what he's planning after that? But it'll be interesting to see kind of how that race goes too. With there does seem to be a generic advantage for Republicans. So there might be certain races where Democrats able to defeat that sort of generic feel of Biden pulling things down maybe for them and being in a slight advantage light red state, maybe lean red. So it'll be interesting to see if those all hang on the edge of the margin of error, or they the Republicans are able to kind of get comfortable leads.
That race also of particular interest, the Bishop Jackson race, in that Republicans have not won an attorney general's race in North Carolina since the 1890s.
I think they got two appointed, maybe.
Yeah, there's no one alive who remembers a Republican winning an attorney general's race in North Carolina, so that will be one definitely to watch. I think all of these are going to be interesting. One that struck me as particularly interesting was that Farley result, because there were a lot of Raleigh insiders who thought that John Hardister was the guy, the state rep from Guilford County, was going to win. After Farley won, we saw even the North Carolina Chamber came out with something that was concerned about Farley and Morrow winning, and saying that these aren't the people we're used to dealing with. They could be problems. But in the case of Farley, he has a big lead according to our poll, and even Michelle Morrow within that margin of error, slightly ahead of Mo Green in that race. So very interesting ones to watch.
I think there's an interesting dynamic there where maybe there's an old guard establishment on the conservative side, and then there's kind of a insurgent grassroots kind of, and they're almost becoming the ones with the advantage in a lot of these races. Maybe the kind of a Trump dynamic where a lot of grassroots and more populist candidates, that the establishment's like, oh, we didn't see this coming, like with somebody with Morrow. They do have a lot of energy within the base of the party and are able to win some races and surprise some people like the Chamber. So.
Before we wrap things up, there's one other piece that we did not show a slide on, but I did want to mention, and this is that Signal, the company that actually does the polling for Carolina Journal, comes out with a segmentation analysis. They look at the group that they poll and try to break them down in various ways. And in their segmentation analysis, they said that their particular polling group had about 41% who they would describe as Republican base, 38% as Democratic base, and then 21% as persuadable. These are the people who are going to end up deciding things, because the Republican base, as long as they turn out, they're going to vote for Republicans. Democratic base, if they turn out, they're going to vote for Democrats. The persuadable people are the important group, and the persuadable segment, according to the folks at Signal, largely believes that the U.S. is on the wrong track. Most would vote for generic Republican, either for legislative races or congressional races. 2/3 of them disapprove of Biden's job performance, but a similar number approve of Cooper's performance. It's just something you noted earlier. More than 3/4 of this segment, this is the persuadables, plan to vote for Trump on the presidential ballot, but they're unsure how they're going to vote in the down ballot races. So a lot of work for all these candidates to do.
Absolutely, yeah. That's an interesting sign. If you find the only people that are persuadable and say they're really thinking it over are ones that are kind of the Republicans to lose at this point, that's not another not great sign for Democrats in this poll.
Yeah, unless something changes in a major way between now and November. Well, we've really scratched the surface of this poll. There are many things that you can find out. You can look at the details, finding them in the slides or in the crosstabs, all of which you can find at carolinajournal.com, made available today. And we hope that you will dig into these items, find out more about the Carolina Journal poll, and tune back in as we have more Carolina Journal polls throughout the year leading up to the big election. David Larson is opinion editor at Carolina Journal. David, thanks so much for your analysis.
Thank you.
My name is Mitch Kokai, and thanks once again for joining us for this analysis of the latest Carolina Journal poll.